It seemed like another great topic to share with you is sort of the history of horological illustration, which definitely is different. Let's see, is different than the subject that you may know that I've been involved with more than 20 years of horology and art. So this is sort of a subset of that, but this horology and art bigger topic deals more with paintings going back to Rembrandt and even before that have clocks and watches in them. And you may recall I ran the symposium on this back in Boston in 2017. But this is a different subset of that, and it spins off of the a talk I gave at the 2022 Time Symposium that I organized in New York about horology's great collectors. And at the beginning of that, we had a tribute to John Redfern, and you see me giving my talk there in the library in the building that the Horological Society of New York is in on the fifth floor. Down below, it's in this Society of Mechanics building. They have a great meeting space where HSNY has their meetings and where we had our 2022 symposium. John Redfern was a major sort of more than expert in horological illustration and animations. He passed away in 2019, and we felt like it was time to give him the kind of recognition that we gave him in the beginning of our symposium in New York. So you see that, but here's just a jaw-dropping better version, and this is just a still because these were animations. So once he did this, and apparently he spent months creating these computer simulations of how watches work. And it really, you'll hear me say this a few more times, but just be aware that illustration, if it's done to this quality by real artists, is far more powerful than photographs. And if somebody took a picture of these wheels and gears and hairsprings, it wouldn't have the kind of punch that an artistic illustration can have. And again, I'll bring this up again because it's important to think, why the heck are we, why is some artist sitting there drawing this stuff when all they have to do is whip out their iPhone and take a picture? But there's a big difference between an art rendering of things and a photograph. So if we're heading way back in time, as I start the story of horological illustration, this is Leonardo da Vinci. Probably would have been an honorary member of your chapter if he'd still been alive. And he already, back in the 1400s, was illustrating clockwork things. So you can see that this is a drawing of a stack freed, the system that preceded the fusee for trying to even out mainspring power. And you'll also notice in a couple of these illustrations of Leonardo da Vinci that you see his backwards writing. That was his code. It wasn't that hard to figure it out, but he didn't want people to be able to read his notes that easily. And he did this kind of encoded backwards writing that you'll see again. So again, this is Leonardo da Vinci with that backwards writing, and you see that he's already illustrating clockwork, watchwork, because that was one thing he'd do as he studied all kinds of growing technology in his era. He was illustrating, taking notes, studying, trying to improve these kinds of things. So this is, again, as you see, it's Leonardo's drawing showing the earliest recording clock with warned striking. So again, Leonardo da Vinci is drawing clockwork. But this illustration is from one of the major important books, either written or published and written by John Roby. I hope that at least some of you have this book and several of his other books that he's produced through his publishing company over there in England. I visited John Roby, as I'll show you in a minute, but this is the kind of illustrations that John Roby put into his books as well. So there's, again, something you'll hear me say. There was horological illustration that was done to educate, to instruct, and others as marketing kinds of things too. And we'll talk about both of those, but clearly, this isn't intended to be a work of art to hang on your wall. And yes, unless you're kind of clock nuts like we are, or maybe we would want this on our wall. But this is technical drawing, educational drawing to help people understand how these things worked. So as I mentioned, I visited John Roby. He's getting quite on in years. His eyesight sadly isn't that good anymore. But I was nearby. I was in Derby, England last fall giving some lectures, and he lives only about 10 miles from there. So I just made it my business. He was one of these guys I wanted to meet before he's gone or I'm gone. And my wife and I had a wonderful, almost a full day visiting John in his home there in central England. I also, a place where I got to see a lot of great horological illustrations is the British Museum. As some of you may know, there's the horological study room that's down in the basement. And if you make an appointment and go there, you're welcome to look at clocks that aren't on display, watches they'll bring out. And the last time I went, I asked if I could look at their horological prints and illustrations, and they brought out, these big bursting files of papers with all kinds of interesting prints in them. This is the example of 1500s illustration. So I just sat there and went crazy with my camera, grabbing a lot of these images that are both good for my horology and art interest and for talks like this that are about the illustration of horology. So here we have Galileo, and this is an illustration by Galileo or an illustration of Galileo's clock. We talk about how he really was the guy that inspired Huygens half a century later to commercially develop pendulum-controlled clocks. But the credit has gone to Galileo, who initiated the concept, and we believe that Huygens knew about that and sort of had planted the seed that you probably could apply pendulum to clockwork and greatly increase the accuracy. So this is a sketch of a drawing of the pendulum clock that Galileo envisioned. So also in those beautiful prints here, this is just another example as I pulled these leaves out of the folders and looked at them. This is, as you see, Oliver Cromwell's big fancy watch that I guess he had a big pocket to hold it. And it's kind of interesting because we thought about during that time, they weren't into ostentation. That was sort of the beginning of pear case watches that were quite plain on the outside. People didn't want to show off their wealth that ostentatiously, but it looks like old Ollie Cromwell didn't mind having a clock that was quite decorative. And this print that probably a lot of you are familiar with too, of one of the earliest depictions of a clock-making shop. You see where they're actually forging, building these clocks, creating those very earliest of machines. You see a guy there over on the right who's pulling the weights up on these machines. So, and you can learn a lot from these. This is probably getting into the artistic category. It's more than just educational, but it's showing us, I believe, quite realistically what a clockmaking shop would have looked like all those centuries ago. Of course, if you go upstairs in the British Museum to the public areas and galleries, there's horological illustration there too, as they're trying to explain to the visitors how these things work. So, and again, if you look at this, if this were a photograph, it'd be nowhere near as interesting or as easy to comprehend. The ghost galleries, of course, are not filled with illustrations. They're filled with actual clocks. So I loved grabbing this picture of these young British kids taking a look at one of Congreve's rolling ball clocks. So, I hope they believe in getting these kids early, and maybe, one of these kids, we planted the seed where someday he'll be a clock collector or a clock repairer or both. So another early book, and again, one that I own, is by Antoine Tillot, a Frenchman. You see it's 1741. I've been a member of the Grolier Club, which is a book collectors organization, probably the oldest and most prestigious book collectors group based in New York City. And when you become a member, they really want you to display your stuff. your collection. So in the new members collect, I brought about 5 things of mine that I own that I was proud to show. And the TO book is one of them. You can see just from this picture, and you'll see more, that they had these beautiful engraved fold-out plates in addition to all the text about this. So here's one example of these, and you sure want to find this if you buy that rare book. Sometimes people have X-Acto knifed out these plates and framed them up somewhere else. But so I was lucky that my copy of the book retained these beautiful illustrations. Here's yet another one. So again, this is artistic work. You see, it's not just line drawings. There's shading, there's cross-hatching to try to bring out the depth and the relief and the detail of these complicated parts, which, theoretically, people who bought this book were interested in trying to make their own clocks. And this is probably scaring off most of them when they saw the complication of the things they were going to have to make. So this is Diderot. You may know that he and his collaborator spent decades producing an encyclopedia of all the world's knowledge, which they could. You see in my bookcase here, the black one in the middle, that's just his section on horology that has few hundred pages, a few hundred illustrations just in the horology section. The Diderot Encyclopedia is many, many volumes, but fortunately they did zero in on horology and gave us some great information about them. Here's the cover page of his encyclopedia by Diderot, and here's an example again of the kinds of engravings, the kinds of drawings that you see in those publications. And fortunately, again, you don't have to buy the whole original encyclopedia. There are reprints of this where you can see what he was presenting. Again, the beautiful line engravings. Again, it took an artist who knows how many hours, days to produce this in a way that is so compelling and beautiful, really. Here he is, another picture. You see this is a wheel cutting engine, and a pretty exotic, fancy one, as you can see, but this is what Diderot chose to illustrate in his encyclopedia. And another example too, this is a weight-driven movement he's showing us. You can see that it's certainly an early pre-pendulum one with the crown wheel and verge up top here and the weights hanging down below. Another rare book that I'm quite proud and fortunate to own is Berthoud's book from the later 1700s, and this is about marine chronometers. This also has fold-out plates. Here we see Berthoud holding up an illustration of one of his watches. Here's the title page again. You see it's 1773 is when he produced this. He did some other instructional books as well, but this is the one that was particularly focused on marine chronometers, marine horology, because Harrison wasn't the only guy who was perfecting timekeeping in the ocean. Berthoud was involved in that as well. And this is an illustration of one of the Berthoud chronometers that he produced. You see it's in a different type of gimbal, not in a wooden box, but this also hopes to keep it level on shipboard. There's examples of these. They exist in museums in Paris where you can see the real ones of these. Again, here's more illustrations from Berthoud's book, where he was, of course, trying to deal with temperature compensation. And you see on the right there, he had a gridiron set up for temperature compensation that probably worked as well as Harrison's did, if you get those right. And here's just some illustrations again from Berthoud of the type of tooling that he needed. Sometimes we think of these clockmakers from the 1600s or 1700s that were sitting there, with a file by flickering candlelight making this stuff. These guys in the 1700s, they had complicated machines like you see here. They were not, just winging it. They had, and it's almost a precursor to modern manufacturing, where it's the machines that make the things that are important, not the things themselves. The real innovations were the machines that allowed people to make these kinds of things. James Ferguson, a English clockmaker, philosopher, scientist, active in many fields. This is a orrery which he produced, a beautiful, of course the machine is beautiful, but this artistic rendering of it is beautiful as well. And then you can understand understand the gearing is quite complicated to show the actual movements of the planets around the sun. I mentioned Ben Franklin. You see his portrait here with the little bells he had in his house that indicated when the atmosphere was electrically charged. Those little bells would jingle a little bit. You see the lightning through the window. But I mentioned Franklin because Franklin invented this simpler three-wheel clock that some of you may be familiar with. He was trying to invent a clock that was simpler to make, would be cheaper, that clockmakers could produce, and they'd be affordable. It has this odd 4-hour this 6-hour dial that probably doomed the design because too many people couldn't figure out what time it was looking at the dial. But this is connected to Ferguson because Ferguson worked on this too and tried to make it a little more, turn it into an 8-day from a daily wind and tried to make it a little more understandable. But it was John Whitehurst in Derby who, I know it looks like Derby, but they pronounce it Derby. John Whitehurst made those prototypes for Franklin, and this is what an actual one of those Franklin clocks looks like. Thomas Mudge had to produce a book. He produced a book about marine timekeeping in order to, again, try to get some of the longitude money. You see Thomas Mudge sitting there on the left. This is the 1799 title page. And this book also had plates and fold out or within there. So you see he was illustrating concepts that he was using in his marine chronometers to both to educate the public, but also to prove that he'd done something like this in order to try to get some government compensation for doing this. Can you see some more of his illustrations from his book about how he was making these machines accurate and reliable? Let me flick back here because if you look down at the bottom, you see that name PAS, P-A-A-S, underlined in red. That's because many of these prints, many of these engravings were done by professional artists. And in this case, they were contracted by people like, Berthoud and Mudge to produce these. But, Mudge wasn't able to be to do artistic renderings like this. So you see the name PAS, and here's a trade card from this company. As you see, Pass and Company, you see they were bookbinders, printers, also engravers and printers. So they were the artistic firm that generated some of those images in Mudge. Some of you too may have this reproduction catalog that Winterthur put out about 40, 50 years ago of the tools. It's one of the only known clock tool catalogs from the 1700s. But again, it already shows us that, again, these guys were not just working with buck knives. They had exotic, elaborate, specialized tools to make this kind of thing. So here you see, for example, again, in the John Wick catalog, you see this is the special tool for grooving those barrels. And some of us have seen, American tall case clocks with barrels that aren't grooved. And, I guess the chords kind of line up okay on there. But if you want grooves on those barrels, you need a machine like this to do it. So another book I have with great illustrations, Clockmaking by Reed. Here's the title page, 1826. Again, instructional. This is so people could learn how to do it. They didn't have YouTube back then. They had to learn from books and, of course, through apprenticeship. But here are some illustrations. Again, beautiful things you see down below. The engraver's name is there. And, again, shading, cross-hatching to make these images really pop off of the page. Here again, we see a beautiful close-up of a crown wheel and verge. You can almost imagine that wheel turning and those pallets slapping against the faces of the crown wheel teeth. This is a good one too, because again, take a look at that name down below. Lizars, they were the engraver, the publisher, and here's another customer of theirs, Audubon. You see down below, engraved by Lazar, so in Edinburgh. So these engravers were, not just drawing pictures of clock gears. They were deeply involved in artistic, other types of natural history illustrations, including for Audubon at that time. Piranelli also produced this. So these are more obviously not technical, but he was drawing designs that possibly would become real clocks. I have several examples of these. I don't know if I've ever seen clocks because he was just designing, suggesting designs for clockmakers and clock case makers to replicate. Not many of them perhaps did so. This one was from a big book of clock designs that people could, buy, and then, founders and engravers and model makers would make clocks from these images and prints. So clearly, watch papers are part of horological illustration as well. I hope that at least some of you know about these, have found them if you were lucky inside of a pocket watch you may have bought. This one is not that interesting, but I wanted to show you one that was pushed into the back of the watch, which is where we always find them. But I'll show you a few more examples because these truly are horological illustration, and some are just beautiful. These are engravings, that then were printed. So here you see Thomas Daggett from Providence, Rhode Island. He's got a great couple of clock, watch, keys up there, flowers, that type of illustration. This guy worked right near me. I'm in Andover, Massachusetts. He was in Haverhill, Massachusetts. See, he's got some intermeshing gears up there and a hairspring on his, John C. Foster. I love this one. We're getting closer to where you folks are. See, this guy in South Carolina. This is pretty rough. I think it looked like, somebody who wasn't that great an artist or an engraver produced this, but look at that great little kid there. He's got a loop. He's got a watch in his hand. Here's the ship arriving. John McKee there in Chester, South Carolina. And I had to find some Georgia ones for you. So you'll see a few of those. Yeah, I couldn't find an Atlanta one. Probably there were Atlanta watchmakers that had watch papers, but in the collections that I've looked at, I didn't find one. But here's one from Savannah. And if you check this out, you can see clearly this guy was a Mason. He's got Masonic imagery there. Here's Augusta. This has Mr. Catlin here. You see the winged hourglass up top, and you see the Rawlinson name way down at the bottom. So some of these watch papers actually are signed by the artist, and Rawlinson was the artist. And there's the beehive. We have beehive clocks, we have beehive imagery and clock glasses. The beehive was a symbol. Everyone understood it was a symbol of industry, hard work. Every working as hard as those bees work when they're building their hives and collecting the pollen. Certainly, watch factories used a lot of horological illustration, both of their factories and of the things that they produced. Again, you see down on the bottom, we have the artist himself has signed this, but here's the earliest view of the Howard Watch and Clock Factory, again, near Boston, where I live. Unfortunately, the building's not there anymore, but we have this great illustration of the factory, and in their catalogs, and we'll show you a lot more catalogs that some are familiar, maybe some not. Again, they didn't have photography. They needed to have engravings, drawings, which then were produced in prints. So, of course, here's the page showing the Howard banjo clock that everybody understood. So these were drawings. There were artists who had to sit there and draw these out in beautiful perspective and make them into marketing tools. So here we have, again, a Howard, one of their astronomical clocks. So I don't know if you've ever tried to do drawing like this, but it is not easy. And once they did it, though, they could reproduce it and make these products appealing in the company catalogs. Here we have 1879 Seth Thomas illustrated catalog. Again, you're probably familiar with this early version of their regulator number 2. Again, hand-drawn. They had to get the wood grain in there. They had to replicate that very detailed, complicated, reverse-painted glass down at the bottom. And again, they dealt with turret clocks, as we know. There are a lot of Seth Thomas turret clocks still around. A great perspective drawing, shadows. We can see every detail of this. Again, that was not produced with an iPhone camera. And even showing a Seth Thomas turret clock, 1912, how it would be installed in a tower for the people from the church or the town or the city that wanted to understand what they were going to be buying from Seth Thomas and how it was going to be mounted in their town. Chauncey Jerome put out his catalogs quite early. This is an 1853 one in New Haven. Of course, also the illustration of his factory was there on his labels inside of his clocks. So again, some more illustration to make people understand that his clocks were not made in some backwoods shed somewhere. They were made in a real modern factory. And L.E. Jerome was one of the sons of Chauncey, and he was quite innovative and inventor, not that well known, Luther. But I show you this picture because this is a patent application drawing. And I have a collection of these. You might remember I spoke about these a little bit before, but this is, again, it had to be artist generated. This is the original design patent application that somehow got away from the patent office. I think they deaccessioned a lot of this stuff. But you can see down at the bottom that the patent application was actually rejected a couple of times in 1886 before it was finally accepted. And you see Luther Jerome's signature down at the bottom. A lot of these patent illustrations that I have, again, I could never find that they were actually manufactured, but this one was. This was one of these parade lantern clocks that, again, some of you may own or have seen, and this was on the cover of this classic book that I'm sure a lot of you own on Horology Americana. And you might remember that I spoke about my horology and arts and religion symposium that I co-curated about a year ago at Gordon College. And there's a view again of that. But in that room on the side, I show you this because there was that whole wall of some of these horological design patents that I own and that we put on display there. Corsi and Sonia, we're looking again at these major clock companies and their horological illustrations as they apply to their marketing campaigns. You see, they had to make these clocks look good so that the dealers and customers would want to buy them. Perhaps they had the catalog on the counter. They didn't stock every item, but customers could come in and pick clocks out of the catalog as well. So again, we see this along with what the different variations of them cost. New Haven, and probably all of you have Tran books, and he went around and he gathered up these old catalogs, as you probably know, and reproduced them into these company catalogs and, mounted them up, pasted them up in a way where, every page you find these beautiful illustrations of those companies' products. We have the Gilbert clocks, and again, it just sort of boggles my mind almost that artists in whatever kind of well-lit big rooms with desks, were sitting there with their ink pens and their pencils, drawing all this, and I'm sure it was not easy, and I don't know if they could use erasers or not, but but you had to be a pretty darn good an artist to make this happen. There was an issue of the 1884 Scientific American that gave great details about the Waltham watch factory and what was going on there, and with these great illustrations. So here's an example where you see those narrow, long buildings with daylight pouring in through all the windows along, and just these rows of workers, many of them women. 40% of the Waltham employees were women working away. So again, a great illustration of, not a photograph, illustration of what factory looked like inside the Waltham watch factory. And here another example from that Scientific American series where you see this fellow enameling those watch dials, and you probably know that was pretty tricky work too, and a lot of them didn't work. They'd pull them out of the kiln and they'd be cracked or something. So this was quite a delicate process as well. So Waltham, certainly made all kinds of great things, including these speedometers with attached clocks that were used in cars. Again, this is all drawing, not photography. The Sears catalog, again, 1,000 pages, not photographs. Legions of artists had to sit there and draw all these things and draw them accurately and in a way that would make you want to buy them. But now we're getting up certainly into the age of photography. This is the Waltham Material Catalog from 1948. But again, they had to draw this stuff. Those are not photographs. That was a big, thick catalog, and every page covered with these kinds of illustrations, some of them to scale so that the watchmaker sitting in his shop in Atlanta or in Massachusetts, could find the part that he needed, make sure it was the right one, and order it from Waltham. Here's another view. Again, here's one of those aircraft clocks there, so the slightly larger version. All those parts, beautifully illustrated. Look at the top left there. He's got the highlights on there. The way the light hits those plates is just beautifully rendered. And here another Waltham where all these parts. You look at those winding wheels down below, with the highlights and shading on them to make them really look like they would have looked if you were holding that actual part in your hand. So here's the Navy Department's booklet about how to, from World War II era, October 48 afterwards, talking about the Hamilton ship chronometer. Again, not a photograph. This is somebody, a skilled artist, was doing this, and they did it not because they couldn't have had a photograph, but it would not have been so precise, so appealing, so clear if you were the guy on shipboard, perhaps trying to repair one of these chronometers. A drawing was far easier to comprehend, easier to see than a photograph would have been. So here's, again, from that same thing, that same 1948 Hamilton instruction manual showing how all these parts went together. It's, again, some very skillful drawing here with vertical lines showing how the parts would mesh together. Some of you may still have one of these old Best Fit catalogs. A thing, you could probably kill somebody dropping this on their head. They were so big and thick. But again, full. Look at this page. Every single one of those parts was drawn, not photographed. So thousands and thousands of horological illustration within the Best Fit catalog. Here you see, here's some Omega movements. So every one of here, you see the movements down the side on the left, then the various parts with their imagery there, so that the guy ordering the parts knew he had the right movement he was ordering for and knew he had the right part that was going to work in there, down to the individual screws. Look at those, little screws lined up there. Somebody had to draw every one of those. And of course, in the Keep books, there's an early one from LaRose. I'm sorry they're not in business anymore, but I'm sure a lot of us bought a lot of stuff from LaRose when they were in business. Again, those are all illustrations, not photographs. And also the Swan book. I hope some of you at least have this. I had it and recently passed it on to another guy, where this guy, Swan, as you see in 1978, just not only did all the gear counts, provided whoever had his book with, all of the most obscure, tiny details about American clock movements, and also illustrated them. So what a tremendous job. And so every one of his movements, there were hundreds of them, kind of American movements with these exploded diagrams showing how the thing went together. I'd like to think even earlier in my career, I don't need this. I know how this stuff goes. But I have to tell you, I went to the Swan book way more than one time to say, now, wait a minute, where does that wheel go again? So it was extremely helpful, and we really owe Swan a great debt of gratitude too for producing all that. So here's the Smithsonian Museum of History that I hope a lot of you have visited. I'm showing this because for more than 30 years, David Todd was their conservator there. I was able to rescue his papers from the dumpster, and they went into on their way to the dumpster, and they were on their way to and they now are at the Horological Society of New York. But he was an incredibly skilled clock maker. He could certainly, not just a conservator, and a lot of what he did, a lot of what you saw in his papers were illustrations like this. I mean, just mind-boggling, where he'd get a clock to work on. You see up top left, Thomas Tompion, number 66. And whenever he worked on something, restored it, he made these kinds of scale drawings beautifully in color, listed everything, and just, to think that all of this might have been lost if he was ill and there weren't enough people around trying to help him sort out his affairs. But luckily, a friend of mine who helped him a lot was able to grab these things and then get them to me for me to pass along to where they really belong. So here's another example of David Todd's drawings that were in there. And this is his drawing of a folio demonstration that was used in the Smithsonian to show people how they worked. And there's the actual machine that he made after doing the scale drawing, knowing how it was going to look. So this gives you a sense too of his skill as a clockmaker, that he made this beautiful, instructional, educational replica of a folio escapement so people could understand how it worked. George Daniels, clearly one of the world's finest watchmakers ever, and certainly one of his skills was horological illustration. Some of you may own this book and just, goggled over the quality of not only of his watchmaking skills, but of his watch illustration skills. This again is just a beautiful rendering. Again, I'm going to repeat again, a photograph would not do this justice. And his acolyte, his successor, his apprentice that then went on to do his own incredible work was Roger Smith. So you see one of his purpose-made watches there, and you see he came to a Horological Society of New York. He gave a lecture there too about he's one of the superstars of global watchmaking. He gave a nice talk there, and there's an example of his illustration work. That, again, not a photograph. This is a drawing that no doubt took him many hours of one of his watch movements. I was lucky enough to be at a table with him. Here he is talking to my wife at a Horological Society of New York banquet a couple of years ago. He seemed to be quite happy not to have to talk about watches and clocks with Jean. They were having a great conversation about other kinds of things that Roger and Jean shared an interest with on that evening. David Penny, another one of the world's greatest horological illustrators. You see him giving a talk in England at a conference I went to some years ago. So here's an example of his illustration work. Again, just beautiful. He's a master, again, of showing these kinds of things. And as you see, he's illustrating one of the earliest Arnold chronometers here. And he's a dealer of these things, and he has incredible things. If you get Antiquarian Horology magazine, you'll see his ad in there every quarter. But you see that even on the right there is an illustration of his. He's showing a balance from this clock that he's selling. If he just showed a picture of it, nowhere near the same appeal and punch of using one of his beautiful illustrations to show that. And here's my friend Richard Ketchen, who lives near me in Carlisle, Massachusetts, probably one of the country's best clock makers himself and restorer. I'm lucky to know him. He does incredible work, and he does tracings of all the parts, that he wants to keep a record of, that he may have to replicate someday. So here you see him. I visited him at his shop. Here he is tracing out a clock from a Willard tall clock so he can replicate it if he can. So here again, this clearly is horological illustration. He could have snapped a photograph, wouldn't have been to scale, perhaps wouldn't have been as precise. And this is a Richard Ketchen drawing of the hands in case he ever had to reproduce them. And he makes hands like this, beautiful steel cut hands, but here he's got the template to make it from when he needs it. There's, of course, the lighter side of horological illustration. This is a New Yorker cover back from the 1940s. I've been collecting these New Yorker covers. They had their 100th anniversary recently. They've produced more than 5,000 issues in that time, but I love their covers. And here's another one that shows a watchmaker at work from the 1960s. I was lucky enough to buy the original artwork for this. I own it. It was a watercolor, so that's great. And there's going to be an exhibit of these that I'm curating at the Clock and Watch Museum in Bristol, probably at the end of this year. So I hope some of you will want to come up to Bristol maybe next spring and see that exhibit. And of course, I'd also be happy to do a little talk about those New Yorker covers too, for you folks someday too. So as we get near the end, here's again one of those New Yorker covers. I love this one, showing the cuckoo flying out of Big Ben here. Great. Those New Yorker covers, every one of them is exciting, fun art to take a look at. But I'm bringing that up too because here's Keith Scobie Youngs, who owns Cumbria Clock Company, that spent 6 years restoring the clockwork in the tower there where the Big Ben Bell also lives. So here's an earlier illustration of the movement that he totally restored up at his Cumbria Clock Company up in Penrith in the Lake District in England. And I'm fortunate enough to be able to go there. I think, is it? Yes, next Saturday I will be there giving a talk. I will be giving a new version of the talk that I gave as the Dingwall Below lecture last October at the British Museum. Some of those folks, including Keith, weren't able to be at the museum last October. So I said, look, I'll make a slightly different version of this talk and I'll come give it there. So they're having a lot of the clock and watch people from that area come to his workshop. They'll get a tour of his shop where they're still restoring all kinds of old important turret clocks from England, and I'll be giving my talk there. This is me when I was giving the talk in the British Museum. It was in their big beautiful atrium. The auditorium was under renovation, so I gave my talk out there in this great inspiring place there. And included in my talk, because it was about the 1851 World's Fair in London, the Crystal Palace, most of those illustrations of the fair, because photography was still very young then, were again these kinds of line drawings that were published in newspapers and exhibit catalogs, those kinds of things. And here you see the major Dent turret clock display that was in a central aisle that everybody walked by and saw as that went on. So horological illustration continues to this day. You see a cover of the AWCI magazine. Again, I keep repeating myself, but if this were a picture of a balance, nowhere near the same punch. This is a beautiful artistic rendering of a balance system. And my final image, again, this is just out of this weekend's Wall Street Journal magazine, IWC. That magazine always has a lot of luxury watch ads in it. And sure enough, IWC did not, throw up a photograph of the watch they want people to lust after and spend a lot of money on. They used an illustration of it instead. So horological illustration is not archaic, passé, primitive, out of date. It's happening today. It's important, and I'm happy to be able to share some of this with you. So thanks very much for being part of this fun talk.
That was very interesting. Anybody have any questions at all?
Yeah, I guess.
Right.
So my question for you is how much are computers now used in drawings for horology? I know everything's done by hand, which I think is amazing. I don't know how they did all that, but how have computers affected this craft?
I would doubt that some guy sitting there now with his rapidograph by the window doing even the kinds of illustrations I just showed you at the end. I think that it's computer generated probably in most cases. And, in a way I want to call that cheating, but in a way I'm still glad that, it occurs to them that a picture of that is not going to be good as an illustration, no matter how it was generated. So I think, it's like a lot of this electronic, digital imagery now, it's like almost all of us can be artists now because of the technology, but I still don't think it's that simple. I think, it still takes an artistic and aesthetic sensibility, to take an image you want and turn it into something that makes you want to spend, $50,000 for a watch.
That's right. In addition to the computer skills that it takes to learn the drawings.
Exactly. Yes. Thanks.
Like if you're using AutoCAD or something like that.
Yes.
Great. Thank you.
Anybody else have any questions? No, it's very interesting again. Thank you so much, Bob. I love every time you come on and give us a presentation. It's always very fascinating, very thorough.
Okay. All right. Thank you. I'll hope to see you again.
Sounds great. Thank you. Thank you.